Welcome back to the Rusty Vet Podcast. This is your host, former Army Special Forces veteran, Rusty Vet. Thanks for listening. All information shared on this podcast is based off my personal experience while serving in the United States Army. Today we're going to be breaking down pathways to Special Forces. So before we get into talking about selection in great detail or the Special Forces qualification course, we want to backtrack and actually start from ground zero, which is if you are still a civilian and thinking about joining the military, what steps do you need to take? What's the fastest way to get to selection and then ultimately through the course and out to a team? So I'm going to be sharing with you guys the route that I took, a little bit about my story, and then we'll talk about a couple other routes that you can possibly take. So when I joined at 19, I didn't really know a whole lot about the Army. I had done a little bit of research, and I knew that there was something called Green Berets. They seemed super awesome, so that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a cool guy. So I went down to my recruiter's office and talked to him, and I said, hey, I want to be Special Forces. And he looked at me and said, not going to happen. So I said, all right, well, what can I do? And he said, well, I'm an infantryman. I think an infantryman's the best way to go. Get some experience under your belt. Maybe after you do 5-6 years in an infantry unit, then you'll be ready for selection. So I said, okay, sign me up. A couple months later, I found myself in basic training. 14 weeks of it was something called OSUT, One Station Unit Training. It was a combination of basic training and infantrymen's school. I know that they've recently gone through some changes, but back when I went through, it was about 14 weeks long, and possibly one of the worst experiences of my life. I know that they've kind of relaxed some of the standards for basic training, and I think you're allowed to have your phone now, and you get weekends off, and all sorts of cushy things. When I went through, the drill sergeants could pretty much do whatever they wanted to. So as a 19-year-old, it was probably one of the most traumatic experiences that I had, even after going through the Q course and some of the Special Forces type stuff. So it may be watered down these days, but back when I went through, it was pretty hardcore. So great time there. After I made it through basic training, I was slotted to go to Fort Riley out in Kansas. Now, I didn't know too much about the military, and I was like, all right, well, once they tell you where to go, that's what you got to do. You guys, if you join the military, you're going to come across something called details. So what details are is basically free labor. If there's nothing for you to do, someone above you will find something for you to do. And that was the case for those of us that recently graduated basic training. So we found ourselves setting up for a concert there at Fort Benning, Georgia in the heat of summer. And I looked up and I saw a guy wearing a green beanie. I never seen a Green Beret in real life, and I saw him from across the field, and one of my buddies looked at me and said, hey, that's a Green Beret. I said, really? How do you know? He said, well, he's wearing a Green Beret, obviously. I said, right. So just goes to show how smart I was way back then. So myself and a couple other guys from my basic training platoon walk up to this Master Sergeant Green Beret, and we timidly approach and try to start up a conversation because we're all interested in becoming Special Forces. Interestingly enough, this guy turned out to be a recruiter based out of Fort Benning, Georgia. So once he heard about our interest in becoming Special Forces, he said, all right, wait here. Give me about 30 minutes. I'll be back. I'll have your orders changed and give you guys a contract to sign to go to selection. No idea the Army worked that way. Just goes to show how quickly things can turn around when you least expect it. So he came back about half an hour later. I signed the paperwork, and my orders were changed. I was headed to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and ultimately Special Forces Assessment and Selection. But before I could make it to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, I had to go through basic airborne school. Now, airborne school is based out of Fort Benning, Georgia. So it's basically a couple weeks of running around and falling out of airplanes. It sounds a lot cooler than it is. You're going to be very uncomfortable. You're going to be sitting around in a harness in your parachute for hours and hours and hours. Once you successfully fall out of the airplane about 5 times, you get the shiny set of airborne wings pinned on your chest. And there you go. You are now an airborne whatever. So for me, I was an airborne infantryman, really gung-ho, ready to attend Special Forces Assessment and Selection out in Fort Bragg. So I made my way out to Fort Bragg via an Army-provided bus, myself and a lot of my platoon buddies, as well as some other folks that we picked up along the way. And we showed up at Fort Bragg and had to wait all summer long until we could attend Special Forces Assessment and Selection. Now, during that interim time, you are basically getting conditioned. So you meet with cadre, you fall under SWIC, otherwise known as Special Warfare Training Group, and they make sure that you are in peak physical condition prior to going to any formalized training. So on a daily basis, you're doing PT, physical training once or twice a day, running upwards of 8 to 10 miles in a given time. A lot of the cadre there are super into running, so you're going to be running a lot, and that's really going to be a great thing for you just because you really have no job at that point other than to get in shape and prepare for selection. So, you'll want to read some books like I did, kind of get the down low on what to expect during selection. All the different students in the Q course are housed in the same general area. So you have guys that are about to graduate the Q course, guys who've recently returned from selection, guys who are waiting to go to selection, which in this case I was. So I was just trying to gather as much information, try to figure out, okay, what did I need to do to be successful? Now, prior to going to selection, I had the opportunity to attend something called SOPC, Special Operations Conditioning. And it's exactly what it sounds like. You spend about 3 to 4 weeks just working out at a training area outside of Fort Bragg, and you will work out over and over again. You get as much food as you want. You can take great things like books and protein powder and get jacked over that period of time. But the great thing about that course, SOPC, is that it's basically a precursor for selection. So almost all the events that you'll do, you'll get an inside look in some way, shape, or form. So it's a good pre-test, set you up for success. Guys who are coming over from other line units didn't have the opportunity to go through that course. So the guys coming in kind of fresh from basic training or through another program called the 18 X-ray program, those guys had the opportunity to attend SOPC and were really set up for success. Now we'll talk about selection in another podcast, but these were all the steps and kind of the pathway that I took, coming from a civilian all the way through basic airborne school and then leading up to selection. So the process overall took me about 6 months from start to finish, going from day one in basic training until I was able to attend Special Forces Assessment and Selection. So that's the end of today's podcast. Thanks for listening. Be on the lookout for the follow-on part 2 when we actually get into selection.